Section 3. The Sceptic. The question of Hume's skepticism is much more difficult to resolve. This is principally because skepticism of some form is very close to the heart of Hume's philosophy, so that no attempt to explain it can avoid conclusions about the nature or extent of his skepticism. The problem is, however, that there is room for disagreement over both the nature and the significance of his skepticism. Different interpretations of Hume's philosophy usually differ on precisely this point, not least because the stance taken on this question typically shapes the whole picture of Hume's intellectual activity. Nevertheless, recent work on Hume has shown a discernible tendency to reduce the emphasis placed on his skepticism, at least as it has been tended to be understood. One important reason for this tendency has been the attempt to recover the historical Hume from his latter-day ideological career. For much of this century, the interpretation of Hume has been conducted in the context of explaining and justifying positivism. Beatified as a precursor of positivism, Hume has been studied in the main by positivists and for positivists. As a result, attention has principally been focused on those parts of Hume's philosophy which most easily lend themselves to positivist concerns. Hume's scholarship has thus been excessively influenced by a preconceived idea of its object, and, by selective attention, the philosopher has been found to fit the preconception. So the first important step towards an adequate understanding of Hume is to free him from his post-Humist role of positivist saint. The second, no less important, step is to remove the spectacles ground out by post-Kantian philosophy, the conception that philosophy consists of a core, composed of logic, metaphysics, and epistemology, which is then applied to other, more practical areas of endeavor. This second preconception has two important consequences for the interpretation of Hume. Firstly, it picks out Book 1 of the treatise, and if one is prepared to slum it a little, the first inquiry as well, as the core of his philosophy. In this way, the monument to the positivist saint is fenced off from other uninteresting images of the philosopher. Secondly, because Hume's skeptical metaphysics is conjoined with the decidedly non-skeptical philosophy of morals, politics, and criticism, which shows that Hume's own view of his larger philosophy was not the application of a skeptical core to practical affairs, the view has been encouraged that, where he is not being a skeptical metaphysician, Hume is either confused or disingenuous, a charlatan, who has sacrificed his principles to his self-confessed ruling passion, his love of literary fame. In either case, his corpus cannot be considered a great philosophy, and Hume himself may be regarded as a great philosopher only if attention is charitably restricted to treatise, Book 1, the core of his work. By remembering that Hume was neither a precocious positivist nor a pupil of the modern philosophical curriculum, recent Hume scholarship has been able to loosen the grip of these distorting preconceptions. Most importantly, it has recognized the need to approach Hume's work as a whole, thereby returning attention to previously neglected works, or parts of works. The result of this clearing operation has not been a consensus, but it is true to say that there has been a distinct tendency either to shift the emphasis away from skepticism or to reinterpret its meaning or extent. Once this has been done, Hume's particular brand of skepticism is shown to be more limited than may have been expected, and therefore also less damaging to the natural jurist's point of view. The important difference between the Humean and more recent employments of the notion of skepticism is well brought out by John Wright. In his book, The Skeptical Realism of David Hume, he says, "The present-day notion of skepticism leaves no room for an understanding of the sense in which Hume himself is a skeptic. Hume is a skeptic because he thinks that our fundamental beliefs about reality and our inferring procedures cannot be derived solely from the scientific investigation. Rather, he thinks that they derive from man as a natural organism." This could appear to be beside the point, but this is because it is easy to overlook the important difference that philosophical skepticism, as it appears in the writings of David Hume, is not primarily a philosophy of knowledge, a philosophy of science, nor a philosophy of nature, a general metaphysic. It is a philosophy of man. Hume was mainly interested in the philosophy of knowing insofar as it tells us about the knowing being himself. In the same spirit, it is possible to add that he was also interested in the philosophy of action, that is, in the 18th century sense in moral philosophy, insofar as it tells us about the active being himself. Thus, Wright concludes, instead of being primarily interested in justified or true belief, he is interested in the source of belief as such. Instead of being primarily interested in right action, he is interested in the source of action as such. This last remark is something of an oversimplification, because Hume is very interested in virtuous action. Even so, it correctly serves to pick out that Hume's concern with virtuous actions is as a species of actions, and is not simply an inquiry into the nature of good. The central concern of his moral philosophy is with the source of virtuous action. Hume's philosophy of man, and thus also his philosophy of knowing, is skeptical because it affirms both that we hold mutually contradictory beliefs, and that we employ opposed principles in arriving at different but equally indispensable beliefs. Thus understood, Hume's skepticism is not at odds with another recently emphasized feature of his larger philosophy, his Ciceronian humanism. The Ciceronian connection is signaled most prominently in the letter to Francis Hutcheson, quoted above, at the end of chapter 4. He says there, referring to Cicero's De Officiis, "I had indeed the former book in my eye in all my reasonings." Although this remark should be treated very carefully, the reasonings referred to are not his complete works, but at most the treatise, and perhaps only book 3. Other Ciceronian themes are visible in his stress on the social dimensions of human life, the unacceptability of a destructive total skepticism, and on the consequent need for a more limited form of skepticism which would encourage moderation in the conduct of one's life. This last feature, the necessity of a mitigated skepticism, is obviously very important, but alone it will not explain Hume's philosophy. This can be shown by examining a recent interpretation which follows just this strategy. It will then be possible to show that by filling out the distinctive early 18th century content of his notion of moderation, a better account of Hume's overall aims can be provided. Hume often commends forms of limited skepticism. For example, at one point he distinguishes true philosophers by their moderate skepticism, and at several places in the first inquiry he recommends the perspective provided by mitigated skepticism. Passages such as these have encouraged David Miller to discern a thread of mitigated skepticism running through Hume's corpus. However, if we restrict ourselves to considering Hume's explicit remarks on mitigated skepticism, this turns out to be a rather unenlightening hypothesis. In the first inquiry, Hume distinguishes two kinds of mitigated skepticism. The second is less important. He describes it as the limitation of our inquiries to such subjects that are best adapted to the narrow capacity of human understanding. This variety provides a clue to sometimes forgotten question of the purpose of Hume's metaphysical skepticism, inter alia, to demonstrate the inevitable absurdities that arise when the narrow limits of human understanding are not observed. However, it achieves little more than this. It fails to distinguish Hume's position from others not normally classed as skeptical, Locke's, for example. In fact, skepticism of this form is so limited it scarcely seems to deserve the name. A practicing skeptic of this kind who faithfully keeps within the necessary bounds of human understanding can happily espouse the most non-skeptical of views on all topics that fall within those bounds. Even the most unimaginative of souls who spend their lives without expressing anything more than the commonplace views on commonplace subjects appear to qualify as mitigated skeptics in this sense. To take the case of Hume himself, this form of mitigated skepticism would be exhibited by his essays on morals, politics, and aesthetics, irrespective of their content. The subject matter alone guarantees his skeptical credentials. So, while this type of mitigated skepticism helps to explain why Hume wrote essays on morals, politics, and aesthetics, it is of no help whatever in explaining why those essays express the views they do. The other form of mitigated skepticism has more interpretive value, but equally cannot stand alone as an explanatory device. It is the maintenance of an undogmatic spirit. Hume describes it as the recognition that there is a degree of doubt and caution and modesty, which, in all kinds of scrutiny and decision, ought forever to accompany a just reasoner. His practice of the principle appears less than perfect. The concluding section of the second inquiry both avows and manifests it, but it appears to be forgotten in the concluding paragraph of the first inquiry, where Hume's main epistemological principles lead him to recommend a biblioclastic orgy, which, as John Passmore observes, ought not to exclude the first inquiry itself. Outside these cases, skepticism of this form provides little help in interpreting Hume's work. Although such insights can be gained, they are not of any great power or detail. For example, it is able to provide reasons for Hume's preference for the political essay over traditional styles of academic treatise. As Philipson observes, Hume's attachment to the essay form is more than mere convenience. He deliberately exploits its virtues to create a sophisticated and flexible mode of moral discourse, capable of attracting an intellectual salon and coffee-house readership as well as philosophers and men of letters. It also helps to explain a good deal of his practice in the specifically political essay, at least, where he undermines the more pretentious claims of Whig and Tory alike, typically coming to settle on a middling position of some sort. In the letter to Kames, referring to his essay of the Protestant Succession, he says that the conclusion shows me a Whig, but a very skeptical one. Nevertheless, these essays can be explained at least as well by stressing, as Forbes does, Hume's commitment to the doctrine of moderation made famous by the 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury. It will be remembered that Shaftesbury is one of the late philosophers in England, who had begun to put the science of man on a new footing, listed in the introduction to the treatise. His fame came to rest principally on the Characteristics of Men, Manners, Opinions, Times, of 1711, a collection of works on virtue and related subjects. In the Characteristics, Shaftesbury champions the notion of moderation, and also sets out a political outlook he takes to be characteristic of men of moderation. The qualities of such men are well caught by Forbes' summary: men who were too secure of their temper and who possessed themselves too well to be in danger of entering warmly into any cause or engaging deeply with any side or faction. The politics of such men he describes as being the science of men united in society and dependent on each other. This science was modern in style, suited to the circumstances and interests of a modern commercial society, informed by the new scientific method and the predominantly secular outlook.